like the perfection of masculinity is loving service.
And to be called out of yourself. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So it's not like I need someone to like, hold checks and balances over me to make sure I'm not, looking at things online I shouldn't, but it's I need someone to lay my life down for. I need a beauty to defend. I need someone like that makes sense of all of my masculinity. I need my masculinity to be in service of another. And good questions. Those were really good.
Do you think so?
Yes, really good.
Can you tell us briefly like what you mean when you use the term the masculine genius? You wrote a thesis about this and you speak about it quite often.
Yeah, I don't know if I could put it in a super succinct way. Like John Paul II, when he describes the feminine genius, I'll say this first. When he describes the feminine genius, he describes it as this this openness or this capacity to receive and nurture the concrete other. That's pretty nice and succinct. Maybe because you're the Pope, you can make good succinct formulations like that. But as a seminarian, what I kind of came to was that the masculine genius is the capacity to hold together power with tenderness and weakness with strength. The sign of authentic, like real authentic masculinity is like femininity, an openness to the other, but through love, but in service. So it's combining this power and strength and weakness and tenderness kind of thing. That right there, I think, in a word is or in a few words, but I think it's mostly summarizes the greatness of masculinity.
Okay. So Pope John Paul II not ever talked about masculine genius.
Well, I mean, no one can say everything there is to say about any one topic, and I think what he saw was just there was a real need to clarify some like fundamental things about femininity. He also talks about how femininity, womanhood, motherhood marked his life from a very young age, with his own mother dying when he was little. His sister died before he was born even. And he saw like the gross attacks against femininity that like womanhood is this it is the icon of all of creation. And so like if he could clarify what God intended or what God was trying to reveal through femininity, it was clarifying for all of humanity. But why didn't he say anything about masculinity? I don't really know. I don't know if it just he didn't get around to it, but in some ways he did in certain aspects, right? Like he did write an amazing encyclical on Saint Joseph, the Redemptoris Custos, which lays some beautiful foundations for, I mean, I think some beautiful things about masculinity. He wrote in Crossing the Threshold of Hope, he talks about how original sin was the enemy's attempt to abolish fatherhood. So there was a lot about masculinity, but it wasn't as systematic, I think, as his work on womanhood or femininity. But the short answer is I don't know why he didn't get around to writing it. So that's why I wrote it.
I'm so happy that you did. And I actually want to dive in a little bit into your thesis. You start out by quoting Deacon James Keating, who says, quote, "The principal task for priests in the church's new evangelization will be to figure out how to reach out to, rehabilitate, and then evangelize the American male so as to make him into the man, the husband and father and saint he was always made to be. Dear future priests, dear future fathers, please figure out how to call men to greatness and authenticity. Consider this your first and greatest task." So Deacon Keating here notes that this is the problem of the modern church, a lack of men. So I first want to ask, where did all the men go? And what is to blame for this mass exodus, so to speak?
Yeah, great question. Where did all the men go? I think there's a lot of factors that play into this. I think after the Second Vatican Council, what you saw was a misinterpretation of what was meant by full, active, and conscious participation. What you saw was a flattening out of the liturgy, a sort of vanilla Catholicism crept in. All of the things that that really speak to the masculine heart in terms of the battle imagery, the ecclesia militant, the church on the march, all notions of like the sacrifice of the mass, these great hymns that speak about Christ the King and laying down your life. I mean, so many of these things just kind of went by the wayside, and this sort of feminization, honestly, really is what crept in. There's a sort of Protestantization, if we can call it that, a Protestantization that kind of entered into the church, where the role of the priest was kind of reinterpreted, that his primary role was that of presider at the liturgy instead of the one who is offering the sacrifice, and it just changed the dynamics in many ways. And I think men just began to sense that this isn't the domain of men. This is not where the battle is. This is not worth my masculinity. This is something soft and flimsy and not really worth it. You just lost it. They just lost sense of the fight, I guess. So where did the men go? They drifted. They just started leaving our churches. You also have all of the other factors of cultural change after the Second Vatican Council with the sexual revolution and what contraception did, and no fault divorce, and the way that decimated the family. And you look at the work of Mary Eberstadt, and her thesis is that like religiosity fell off as a result of the decimation of the family. That when marriage and family was attacked, you kind of lost a deep sense of religiosity in the Catholic world, the Christian world. And when you don't have big families, you don't have guys who are willing to enter the seminary, this loss of vocations, all of it all plays together. So yeah, I mean, it's a big, nuanced, complicated issue, but it goes back to the very beginning, what I quoted a moment ago. The enemy's attack in the fall, when he went after Eve, was ultimately an attack against masculinity and fatherhood. He wanted to get Eve to think, he wanted to get humanity to think that God is not a good and provident, life-giving source, but a contentious rival and enemy that we have to be afraid of. So it pitted this sort of the God-humanity relationship as one of master-slave, and that's kind of how he affected the hearts of men and women, and that's what he's been going after it since the beginning. He wants men to forget who they are, and he wants women to be closed off to all of that. And I think we'll probably talk about that a little bit more, but I know it's a massively nuanced question. But I mean, things like the way that we were building our churches, the architecture of our churches, putting churches in the round, that's just not how men relate to each other. You think about the classic style of traditional Catholic churches. You have these long naves where the pews are all perpendicular or parallel to each other, all facing the same direction. The way that they're designed acoustically, that you can sing, you can chant, you can do all the things, but you don't hear your own voice. But you put these churches in the round, you've got men who are kind of in the same eye lines as each other, and all you do is hear your own voice. And so it just disincentivizes men's participation in the liturgy. And so, yeah, I think like I said, I'm just rambling now, but there's a ton of factors, from contraception to no fault divorce to the way we design our churches and the music that we bring into our liturgy. All of it has had a major effect.
One question that I wanted to ask is what are doing currently more men, or is it kind of relying on women, I suppose, to kind of flirt, to convert, to bring men to mass? Are there
to convert
to bring men into your parish or the diocese to get men to be Catholic again?
Yeah, it's a great question. Yeah, there's a lot of great efforts that are underway. I think there's some great programs that I know that are being run in different parishes. I think That Man Is You is an awesome program that's being run in tons of parishes. There's a number of parishes in our own diocese that are running that. Men who meet up at early in the morning, 6 o'clock in the morning, 6:30 in the morning for Rosary, Holy Hour, and just deep fellowship and those sorts of things. When I was at my last parish, every other Friday, I had this group of guys that would get together at 6:30 in the morning for mass and just coffee. They would come over to the rectory afterwards, and we would just kind of share about where we've been, what's going on, and kind of try and guide the conversation to something a little bit deeper. But Yeah, I think part of the effort is, at least I'll just speak for myself. One of the ways that I'm um, trying to solve the problem is a twofold approach with the way that I approach marriage prep. So like it's an amazing opportunity for evangelization. And the way I approach baptismal catechesis, awesome opportunity for evangelization, but also all the work I do with youth ministry that like if we can if we can get young people, young boys to have these encounters with Jesus, then like prayerfully, God willing, they will become like good and holy men. What happened in many ways was that like men stopped knowing how to relate to Jesus. And if you don't know how to relate to Jesus, then you don't actually know how to be a man anymore. And so, if we can get a new generation to like actually have encounters with the Lord, then in some ways, um, yeah, we're solving in some ways the man crisis. It's going to take a little time, though. Um, that's just, I mean, that's some of the approaches that I think, at least I see that, or like that I see around the diocese or that I'm taking.
I asked that because I know that you had mentioned marriage prep, and I've actually noticed a lot of priests marrying really devout Catholics to non-Catholics. And I wanted to know, what is the church's position on that? Because especially when it's devout Catholic women and maybe a non-practicing or non-Catholic man, you know, the church recognizes that men are the ones that are the spiritual leaders, and that it's really their faith that is going to determine whether or not their children retain the faith. And so
Right.
I wanted to ask you, you know, what is up with that? And also, are shared values enough, or does agreeing on theology and being committed to the same ultimate end really matter?
Yeah, well, I think leaving space for conversion, right? Because like if there's a number of couples who um that I can say that I married when I was newly ordained, that that they very much describe what you just they match what you just described. She was really on board, he was not. Um and when I look at them today, like he's had, you know, he in several cases he's undergone some massive conversion, and now they're just these powerhouse couples. So it's like, all right, if I took the approach of saying, well, I'm only going to marry people who are both on fire at the same time, then like I'm not leaving room for the Holy Spirit to do His work. So like, so that's one approach, but also at the same time recognizing exactly what you said, that no, like you do need to have some deeply, it's very important to have, you know, like deeply shared beliefs. Which is why when it comes to marriage prep, you know, I said it's an incredible thing for evangelization that um like my goal is not necessarily to like they better be saints by the time this is done. It's I want them to at least have like a powerful like, or at least a very positive experience with the church, a very positive experience with a priest in the church, and at least the clear conviction that going to mass is going to be a very necessary thing if we're going to live this marriage thing well. That if I can get those three pieces together for, you know, a couple that's like you described, she's on fire, he's not, then like I know that there's at least a good chance that as they begin to live this thing called marriage, that if they are at least starting to come to mass on a semi-regular basis, because look, I mean, we're not dealing with amazing Catholics these days. We're dealing with what we got, right? So if I can get them to at least start coming to mass, and if I can like implant in their memory that there was a priest who really loved us and walked with us and challenged me and opened my mind up to some things that I'd never seen before, you know, all likelihood, like these people that you're talking about, at least in the cases that I've experienced, all of them have been through Catholic school. They went through Catholic school, K through 8, or at least through high school. Some of them even through college. And because Catholic education in many ways is just so broken, and they never had any powerful encounter with the Lord, and they just were given this image of the church being this mamby-pamby, just like nothing. Um, you know, they leave the church, and then as they find and fall in love and they get drawn back towards the church because she wants to get married in the church, like there's this priest who enters their world and says like we're really gonna take our time, we're gonna walk through a lot of sessions, I'm gonna challenge you a lot, but I'm also gonna like share with you the stuff that no one's ever shared with you before about the beauty of the faith. um, so when it comes to all of that, I think that it's just a nuanced approach, I guess. You know, like there's just not a real hard and fast rule about um, like who gets to, you know, who gets over the bar that we get to marry. I don't know. Like it's just nuanced, and And you just got to leave room for the Holy Spirit to do the Holy Spirit's thing.
I think I'm comparing it to, Father Michael Lee, my spiritual director.
Yeah.
He's, I think, encountered more situations where the woman ends up falling away from the faith because the man, not being a faithful Catholic, ends up, dragging her down as opposed to her lifting him up. So I think, his warning signs, he tends to think are more accurate and what's likely to happen. So I was just curious if that was something that you also experienced, or it sounds like you've experienced the opposite.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, well, I certainly believe. I mean, I think his experience is also right. I also know that what I've seen is also true.
Yeah.
I also know that I don't know if every priest does this, but I just have a lot of follow up with all of my couples that after they get married, it's not like, hey, goodbye, or just like call me when you have a baby. It's there's the relationship continues. Like I tell them at the beginning, like you're not going to be rid of me. Like it's and I think that holds them accountable to like what we talked about. So I don't know if that's part of the success there or not, but I think that's an important piece. Yeah.
Going back a little bit, I wanted to understand the meaning of the word zakar,
Yeah.
which means to remember, and nikava, female, which means to be pierced. Can you explain how those meanings play out in reality between the masculine and the feminine?
Yeah, no, that's great. So this goes back to Genesis 1 and 2, where God's creating the human person. It says he made him zakar and nikeva. In most translations, you hear like male and female. The Hebrew words there, they're adjectives, and they translate better as masculine and feminine, or even I heard one person say it's better even translated as active and receptive. That God made the human being active and receptive, which is really cool.
Yeah.
So the Hebrew word zakar. So in Hebrew, there's no vowels, right? So you have like these word families, these word groupings. So the word zakar is related to this other Hebrew word zikaron, which means to remember, and nikeva is related to negeba, which means to open or to be pierced or perforated. And so you can just think about the masculine and feminine, and what you see here, what's being revealed in Genesis, is that when he forgets who he is, when he fails to know who he is and fails to live out of that identity, then naturally she will close herself off, right? So this goes back to the enemy's desire. The enemy longs for men to forget who they are, to forget like the mission, the great call they have on their life, because ultimately he wants to shut down the bride, to close off her heart, but most especially to close off her womb. Like the enemy doesn't want life; he's the enemy of life. So, yeah, you see this you see this all over the place in the male-female dynamic and duality when, like the masculine side of things forgets its mission and call, the feminine side just has this like, ugh. And I think I see that. You see that in the church. I think part of the reason why so many people are drawn towards, I don't know, like authentic spiritual fathers, like real shepherds, like, is because they sense like this is a man who knows who he is, who he's called to be. And like the church, the bride, so willingly opens herself before him to receive the gift that he wants to give.
Yeah.
I'm just thinking about Bishop Strickland in Texas. Like, what an amazing shepherd he is. Bishop Corleone, amazing shepherd. Like these guys who know who they are and live the fullness of their masculinity and fatherhood. And because of that, there's a trust. Like the bride's like, I can trust you, and I'm opening to this. But when like there's some weird, like, I don't know, there's a weird living out of masculinity or a weird fatherhood, or just like I don't know if I can trust, there's a shutdown that happens. And I think that's part of like what's gone on in the church, especially with the sex abuse crisis over the last many years and decades, that the enemy has gone after these men in many ways, seminarians, seminary formators, priests, getting them to, like, through all sorts of things, but getting them to forget who they are and what they're called to be, because he ultimately wants the church to be shut down and not receptive to the gift that like comes through the priesthood to them, namely Jesus. So it's like it's all over the place. But this zakar and nikeva thing, it's so powerful. And it's just right there. Like everything, the mystery of salvation is almost like it's hidden right there at the beginning of Genesis.
I'm so glad that you brought that up, even with the bishops and the leaders of the church, because I never really considered that when I was reading through thesis, and that's a really, really great point. I want to move in the direction of beauty because I just thought that this was one of the most beautiful things that I had read in it. Joseph Ratzinger, Pope Benedict, says Plato saw beauty as a kind of suffering, that the encounter with it came as a shock which takes the individual out of his everyday existence, his own ego, living for himself, nurtures him in a longing for the original perfection that was conceived for him, which he has lost. On to say, the shock of the encounter with beauty is like an arrow that pierces the man, wounds him, and in this way gives him wings, lifts him upwards towards the transcendent. You once described the moment, I think it was at a talk, a Theology on Tap talk that I went to, when a man falls in love or encounters beauty, it's like someone has breached the castle walls. Can you speak more to that and how a woman pierces a man's heart in particular?
Yeah. So that insight there, like in the thesis, I developed this idea that so in like the physiology of the male-female relationship, especially in the sexual act, it's the man who initiates and enters the woman. But in the dynamics of love, in many ways, like the roles are reversed, that the woman is one who pierces the man's heart, which is what initiates and begins the catalyst for the process of falling in love and maturation and transforming his heart into the kind of thing it's meant to be, which is open, receptive, vulnerable, sensitive to another, right? That so this image of the castle. So let me say a word about this. That you think about these medieval castles. This is one of those masculine images that really just like gets me going, right?
Women love it too. I mean, everybody.
All right, great. So we got our ladies who love our castles. All right, so think about the castle. The castle is designed with these big walls, and these external walls, thick and tall and strong, and all of them, the walls are designed to confront the external world. They're outward facing, they're strong, they're stable, all of those things, and they represent in many ways like the outward initiating active dimension to masculinity. Masculinity incarnates this outward initiating active dimension to God the Father, who speaks creation into being, who calls forth these covenants, who goes out from himself, right? Pours out the gift of grace and redemption and salvation, outward, initiating, and active. So those outward walls, they're not just simply, they serve a further purpose, right? Like they're meant to defend the life that's within, right? So a castle would serve no purpose if there was no way to get into or behind the walls, right? That's why a castle has a drawbridge to it. It's a place of vulnerability where the walls are weakest and where life can get in. And the whole point of the drawbridge, this openness, is so that life can come in and flourish, right? So this whole experience of beauty, this experience of being pierced by beauty, one of the things I love doing in marriage prep is, asking the couple to share with me the story of not when they like fell in love, but when they first encountered each other. Because like often in that story, you'll hear something along the lines of, so I was at a party and there was like there's this group of girls over there, but like I just saw her, and there was just something about her that like got me, like it pierced me, it touched me, affected me. Like that's what beauty does. As Pope Benedict Ratzinger says, that beauty has this way of piercing us. It gets past the intellect and the will. It just moves on in. It's this Trojan horse where the good and the true can enter in. I think about the other night I was doing all this work in the rectory or in the office. I closed up shop, turned the lights off, and I headed outside. And for whatever reason, the timers of the lights in our parking lot were off, and so it was pitch black in the parking lot. I'm out here in the country now, right? So I'm not in the city anymore. I'm in the country. So I have this beautiful like vision of the stars, and at the same time, like this like bonfire smell is wafting through the air, and these crickets are chirping, and it was piercingly beautiful. And I moaned. I was like, oh, right, like pierced by this, right? In fact, I got on the phone. I left a voice memo for a buddy of mine who works at the TOB Institute. I was like, Bill, I'm just sitting outside, man, and bonfire got me again, right? Like that's what beauty does. Whether it's a sunset or the beauty of the birth of a child or the beauty of a man, the beauty of a woman, beauty has this way of piercing us. So in this relational dynamic, the beauty of the woman so often is the thing that first gets inside. And then when you think about, as I talk to these couples and have them share about their initial experiences in dating and courtship, and what I name for them is something that kind of went unnamed, that all throughout the course of this courtship, what you were doing is there was these moments where you had to deliberately decide, will I let her into this? Right?
Wow.
You were letting her further into the castle, deeper in to deeper parts of the heart. And these moments were probably, very subtle, or maybe they weren't. Maybe they were overt, and you were just like, as a man, you were very nervous about like, man, I've never told anybody about this. Am I really going to tell her about this? Letting her in, right? So like in that process of falling in love, what happens is you realize someone has gotten in. Like this other person has gotten in. Life has been conceived in the heart, and it's beginning to grow, right? Because the heart is let me flip it. The womb in the woman's body is the icon of the heart, right? The heart is a place, just like the womb, the heart is a place in me that's meant to house another, right? Because that's what the womb is. The womb is an organ that exists in you as a woman that's designed to house another. And the heart's the same thing. Pope Francis, he had this great line one time. He said that happiness is having a heart full of names and faces. I think it's so beautiful. So this castle imagery, that the man's heart has been breached, the castle walls have been breached, the drawbridge has been created, she's gotten in, and he's decided to let her in further and further and further. She goes from being an outsider to being like familiar with the interior of his heart, to then being a native, right? Like that's the idea, that's the goal of marriage, that you become native in the landscape of each other's hearts. That's where you dwell, that's where you abide, that's where you exist. And so like all of that external, outward facing energy in masculinity, like it only makes sense, it only like clicks into place, only reaches its fulfillment, its finality through the process of love. Like a man who hasn't fallen in love, or a man who's not allowed his heart to be open to others, is a strange thing. He's a mystery. He's an enigma unto himself. It's like a monstrance without a Luna inside of it, right? Like a monstrance, beautiful, outward facing, all these shiny things, but it exists for the sake of the thing you put in the center of it, namely Jesus, right? Masculinity exists for the sake of housing another, like protecting, defending, but also like having a tenderness and nurturing that life that's conceived in there.
Speaking to men's hearts, I think men have an innate desire even to just be noble. How can we as women call that heroic nature out of them?
Oh man, yeah. I mean, I think the first thing that jumps to mind is when women live authentic femininity.
And what does that look like? Because I know that it can vary depending on women, but do you think a lot of men have a concrete ideal of what that looks like?
Do a lot of men or women? What did you say?
Do you think men have a concrete ideal of that, or do you think it's subjective depending on the man?
Well, I think, man, what a good question. I think that men are, this is maybe a weird response. I think men are ultimately looking for the beauty of Mary, and women, I think, are ultimately looking for the beauty of Jesus, which I would think is why it's so great that there's both masculinity and femininity already in the heart of the Trinity. So you ask, what does authentic femininity look like? I mean, I think it's Marian. the Marian virtues, the Marian dispositions. I think it looks more and more Marian, which is not to say just like resting on a cloud bank. That's the first thing that jumps to mind. Another part of this, and this is maybe it might take us down a weird rabbit hole, but I also think, have you ever seen a film called The Economics of Sex?
No, but I want
Oh
to.
man, yeah, it's really really good. It just talks about like the supply and demand issue involved with that's created by contraception and what it's done for women competing amongst other women, for men like just not having to really compete for women. And one of the things I think that's tragic in this whole story is the issue of contraception. I mean, just on a physiological, hormonal, like that level, anatomically, all that stuff, like men are like, there, study after study shows that men are immensely attracted to women who are having fertile cycles, right? So like when you take contraception out of the equation, especially the pill, I mean, that's authentic femininity. Like being a woman who is capable of mothering is part of authentic femininity. And like not giving away the goods, so to speak, calls a man to a higher thing where he says, oh, like I have to become the man who's worthy of the mystery that you have not yet unveiled to me. I know this isn't quite like the conversation we have with the people that, you know, maybe you and I constantly bump into, people who are in the Catholic world, but I do think that it's something that touches upon the Catholic world, that like the contraception has in many ways just changed the dynamics of the dating culture, the dating relationship, the courtship thing, the whole narrative of dating.
Yeah, I don't mean to interject, but I think having a society with just less virtuous people or less Catholics, you now have a skewed ratio of men and women in the church. So there's less men, which contributes to like a weird, not necessarily, I guess it depends on your parish or your diocese, but it could contribute to kind of a weird dating subculture in Catholicism just by the nature of there being more women than men.
Yeah.
And then the competition isn't so much having to do with sex, but like just other things, I guess, in general.
Yeah. I read an amazing book earlier this year called Primal Screams.
Oh, I've heard of it.
Okay, another one by Mary Eberstadt. And this is just something amazing that she pointed out that I think is really like, I mean, part of this conversation too, that with a culture that's embraced no fault divorce and delayed childbearing and contraception, what you have is the shrinking of families, where it used to be very normal to have big families, which meant that like a lot of brothers grew up with a lot of sisters.
Mm-hmm.
Now it's just not uncommon that like sisters, one or two sisters don't grow up with any brothers, or one or two brothers don't grow up with any sisters, which means that in those massively formative years, you don't have close contact and exposure to people of the opposite sex.
Ooh.
With and through whom you learn to like what are girls? How do girls respond? How do girls relate? What are boys? How are they different? Like, how do we interact? Without all of that family bonding, that opposite sex, I don't know, maturation and all of that stuff, like there are just millions of boys who grew up who just like, I don't know how to be around girls. I don't know what girls are. I don't really know how to like enter into friendship or relationship. I don't know what makes them tick. I don't know what makes them mad. I don't know what wins their hearts. I don't know what matters to them because they didn't grow up with them.
Mm-hmm.
And then you add on to that the poison of pornography, just giving them like this alternate vision of what femininity is, or what's pleasing and good to masculinity. And you're like, oh, gosh, of course, this is why things are so broken.
Okay, so one thing that was mentioned in the thesis, in 1932, Archbishop Fulton Sheen wrote that we have a famine of good men, that it's the world's greatest need. That was in 1932.
Uh-huh.
And I think we often romanticize the past. I know I do, for sure. Especially our grandparents' generation, the greatest. I'm curious to know if you think that they were really that great, because I was listening to that podcast that you had shared, The Theology of Millennials, and he's also traumatic, by the way.
Yeah.
And in it, he cites that they were the most community involved and church involved generation in American history. But they also raised the baby boomers. So ultimately, my question is, do you think it's a unique problem that we're experiencing in the church, the lack of good men, or has it always been like this?
No, I don't think it's always been like this. I think we're living through unprecedented days in human history. I think that the greatest generation, they raised their children under the assumption that the world that they were giving them into was going to be just like the world that they grew up in, which is to say, like a Christendom world, a world of the shared, like, values that come from a society based on the gospel. That the gospel had invaded and touched and formed all of society's values and structures and all the assumptions. And I think what happened with that greatest generation is that there were evil forces, both diabolical and human, working together to bring about things in the culture that created the perfect storm for their baby boomer children, right? When I hear Fulton Sheen's quote, I mean, it is baffling, right? Like, 1932, a dearth of great men. What would he say today?
Oh.
Like, yeah. I mean, it's one of the questions I can't wait to ask him. Like, what were you seeing and warning us about back then? It's kind of like the Patrick Moynihan when he raised the alarm bells on in the African American community, that at the time 10% of African Americans were growing up in fatherless homes, and he said, this is just going to destroy our culture. People were like, calm down. And now it's like 75%. Maybe it was something like that. Maybe he was had such a prophetic vision into things that were just beginning. I mean, it was just on the heels of the Great Depression. It was before the Second World War. There was maybe a lot of fat and laziness, that the battle was over. Just kind of like King David. He's on his rooftop at the time of year when kings go on campaign. When you stop the fight, that's when bad things happen. But I do think that the days that we're living through are unprecedented and different. So I don't know.
Okay, so I wanted to ask you specifically about millennials, because that is my generation. What are gifts and deficiencies of millennial men? And you can also pick on women, because I don't want this to be perceived as anti-man at all. We love men. Yeah.
I think one of the deficiencies of millennial men is a fear of initiating, a fear of initiating relationship, and a settling for fake battles and fake brides. So video games and porn.
Mm-hmm. Why do they not initiate?
I think part of it is that they weren't fathered into it. I think that you have a multi-generational father wound there, that like masculinity is not like it's much more cultural than anything. Like it's something that has to be handed on and like given into the heart of a boy and drawn out of him. Like a father really has to mentor a boy from boyhood into manhood. I think that there's a lot of boys who are not initiated with the gift of manhood by their fathers or by other significant male mentor figures, and so they just don't know. They just don't know the things that they should know.
I have a question. Is some of it nature, though? Like, are there some aspects of the feminine and the masculine that are so innate in us that, in order for us to go on and repopulate, that there are some things that will always have within us to just act in accordance with.
Well, absolutely. I mean, part of it, I think, is the masculine drive to serve femininity, to lay down the life and to protect femininity, to take the first step. To part of the reason why, like, it just makes sense universally across cultures that the man proposes to the woman. It's not because of sexism or chauvinism, but because it takes the sting of rejection off the woman, that he's supposed to take the risk of rejection. And I think so, like, there's something innate in that, right? It's hardwired into our physiology that, I'm just thinking about, like, when that man came into the theater in Colorado and shot up the theater attendants when the Dark Knight was being played. There was 6 men who lost their lives that day because they literally used their bodies as human shields to take the bullets for their girlfriends or wives. And, like, they didn't pause and think about, okay, what's my role as a man here? They just did it, So yeah, I think
Could you imagine trying to date one of those girls after her boyfriend died for her?
Yeah, no.
Like, sorry, buddy, but
jeez. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, I love your train of thought, and I totally agree with you. And that's why I guess my question is, if that's so innate in us and that's written on our human hearts, male or female, then why are men of this generation specifically not initiating?
Yeah, I mean, it's because it's both. It's both nature and nurture. It's that sticky wicket combo there.
Okay.
And it goes back to the enemy of our human nature, who hates our human nature, who wants men to forget who they are, so they stop initiating. I think we've talked about this before in the past, but I do think that a generation where, generations, this epidemic of pornography, I feel like I keep talking about porn, but I think it's a huge topic when it comes to masculinity and femininity too, but it strikes the heart of men in a different way. When you have generations of men who've grown up just accustomed to bathing their brains in pornographic imagery, just the levels and layers of shame and woundedness and demonic influence, let's just be honest, that affects the heart and the identity of the boy now become a man. Like, there's one, it's like, I just feel so crippled as a man. Why I just can't initiate anymore. But then also at the same time, like, why do I really need a woman when I've got this digital harem that's available to me? When you look at other countries, especially some of these Asian countries, China, South Korea, Japan, the sex industry in particular, this is so weird, but this is where our culture is going. Like, the sex doll and sex robot industry is exploding over there because these men, I don't need women anymore. I don't need to initiate. I don't need a wife. I don't need, like, a real human being. I don't need a real relationship because relationships are messy. Why would I want that? So, like, we just can't undercut the influence of sin and crippling and darkening the mind and intellect. We can't undercut or underestimate the influence of father wounds, of boys just not receiving mentoring from dads. And it's just, there's just so much that's gone into that.
Okay, so I had a few specific questions on particularly initiating dating. Who should lead in vulnerability? Now, this is something that Jason Everett and Father Mike Schmitz have talked about. You had mentioned briefly, part of being a man is placing the burden of rejection off of her and placing on yourself. Father Mike says that the natural inclination of man is to be passive and the natural inclination of woman is to take control. And that's why he prefers to see men take the lead and initiate. Do you think it matters for the sake of the relationship?
Who takes the lead?
Or who leads in vulnerability?
Yeah, I think let me think. Yeah, my initial inclination is to say, I think it needs to be the man. I think if there's going to be growth in an authentic way within a relationship, I think the man has to initiate in that vulnerability, because she has to know that she's affecting him.
I agree. How can men be better at being vulnerable, and how can women?
I would say this, that like to be more explicit about it, um, to literally say the words, can I be vulnerable with you, or
Mm,
I'm going to be vulnerable with you. Um, but like we we need training wheels back on our hearts and relationships, and I think one of them is just like saying out loud the things that we're afraid to say, or saying explicitly the things that we're like just implying. Um, but yeah, I think one of them is or even saying like I don't know how to share with this with you, but I'm gonna just try. Um, or for a woman to say, um, could you let me into that? Or whenever you're ready, I'd love to be let into that, because that's what we're desiring of each other, is to be let into those places. um, and it's vulnerable to say out loud that, like, I would love for you to share that with me, like to be a beggar before each other's hearts, like, because we like, that's how it is. Like, I am the master of my heart, and it's up to me to open the door or not. Like, you just can't barge in there. You're just not Padre Pio. You can't read my soul. So like, you have to elicit vulnerability out of me by being vulnerable. Like,
mm,
and then I elicit vulnerability out of you by being vulnerable. Like, that's exactly what Jesus did. Like, he became the utterly vulnerable one. Like, it comes from the word like vulnus, meaning wound. He became the one who was completely wounded. He was like a living wound hanging and dying on the cross. Why? Because he was eliciting out of us a reciprocal vulnerability. Like, I will be so completely open before you. Will you be open before me? Um, so I think that's one of the best ways to do it, is just being explicit. One of the things that's muddied up the dating world so much is text messaging.
yeah.
Okay, because that's not how we communicate. Like, that's not how our brains pick up like subtle cues. That's not how, like, it's just not how we were designed to communicate. Okay, and it creates a space where there's intentional and desirable ambiguity, right? So I think when it comes to intentional dating, the more that you can get away from the texting thing, and just like we're going to talk on the phone, or we're going to meet face to face, or we're going to write letters. Like, it's I think it protects your hearts, and it forces a definition of the relationship in a way that texting doesn't. um I think that for women, there's so often this feeling like, I'm giving hints, like, I'm giving all the hints, and the guy is oblivious to it. And most often, let's be honest, I think it's often occurring in our texting space.
Mm.
At least it is with a lot of people I know. Like, um, I mean, just like, it's just intentionally ambiguous. It's just so ambiguous. Um, so like, just sidestepping the question a little bit, I just just like, get it out of, just don't text so much. Like, actually talk on the phone or meet in person. Um,
No, I'm
like,
totally with you. I want to get
you know,
honestly, I want to get rid of my smartphone. We should go back to flip phones.
yeah,
Um,
make people like do T9. Like, that'll really like force people to meet up in person again.
yes. To what extent does someone have to be the right fit for you to then marry them?
Well, I mean, there certainly has to be attraction. Um, at least I would think so. There has to be a level of, um, like, I want to give myself to this person. I want to let this person into all that is me. I want to let this person be like welded to my story, and me to their story. So I do think there has to be a level of attraction, um, a level of affectivity, but then it does have to transition into the level of will and volition, because like love, it's I mean, it's the deliberate choice to live the vows. So one of the things that I've noticed over the years is that there's a lot of women who are waiting for the already perfected man, or the man who is already at this certain level of virtue that I'm willing to tolerate. Um, Now, I think about like my goddaughters. and I think about the men that I want them to date and marry. Um, and like in my heart, like I have an image of who I want that man to be and how I want him to, like, the virtues I want him to have, the ways that I want him to treat them. I have a very high bar in my mind, and I want them to have kind of that same high bar in some ways. And at the same time, though, I am fully aware that the very catalyst, the very thing, the fuel that moves the man to become that man in many ways is the presence of that woman, right? So like she is the catalyst that matures him over certain humps, that says, I will arise to the occasion to become even more the man who is like worthy of so good a woman. So like in some sense, there has to be this very high bar, and at the same time, this is why it's so messy. At the same time, there has to be a recognition that like I am I am integral, I am instrumental, I am ingredient in him also becoming that man. Like me, like letting him love me, and him like discovering that I love him, and that like I'm choosing him, I'm moving towards him. Like that is part of the catalyzation of him becoming the man who's worthy of that woman. And like, what should women expect in this dating scene? You should expect sinners, like fallen, frail men, and men should expect sinners, fallen, frail women. But like the process, like the reason why God would put love into any two people's hearts is not because they're both already so good. It's because they're both still so imperfect. Like if anybody's called to marriage, it's because like God has said, okay, you need to be polished. You need to be like sanded down. There's way too many rough edges. And I'm going to give you a person who is your own personal sandpaper, who's going to be wedded to you for life, who their imperfections, their struggles, their sins, their failures is going to be the thing that like forms in you self-giving, self-emptying, self-surrendering love, and vice versa. So like you're like you're gonna find a sinner, no matter what. You're gonna marry a sinner, and because they're sinners, that's gonna be the very thing that makes you into a saint. If you keep choosing to love them, and if they like, if you stay in it and stay vulnerable, and all of those things.